Good afternoon. It's Monday, the 4th of February 2019, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. Joining me in the studio today, Patrick Henningsen from 21st Century Wire. Welcome to the programme, Patrick.
Great to be back, Mike.
Welcome back to the programme, indeed. Well, look, we're going to get straight on with the INF Treaty, Patrick, because obviously just prior to the weekend, the Trump administration announced that it was going to be suspending US participation in the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty for 6 months. Now, this 6-month suspension is defined within the treaty, and this comes a couple of months after Mike Pompeo had issued the ultimatum to Russia to either withdraw the 9M729 cruise missiles from service and destroy them, and they had to be, according to the ultimatum, had to be verifiably destroyed. So that's what has brought this 6-month suspension in place, and what the United States seems to be saying is that if that destruction and that verification doesn't happen, then the US will withdraw completely from the treaty. The treaty will end, and the US is going to go ahead with new arms development. So, what's your thoughts on this?
Well, this isn't the first treaty the United States has withdrawn from. In the late 1990s, the U.S. began looking at the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, the ABM Treaty, which they effectively withdrew from under President George W. Bush in 2002. And the reason behind that withdrawal, Mike, is interesting, and that brings us to the present day, was to guard against an errant missile attack from a rogue terrorist organization. So that was under the sort of the guise of the war on terror back then. But what it did is it freed up the United States to sort of implement the kind of expansion you're seeing now around the arc of the Russian border. Specifically, we're talking about Eastern Europe and the 13 new NATO countries that have come online in the last 2 decades. So I think this is what we're looking at here, Mike. I think this is the United States wanting to establish some room in order to catch up, let's say, on what looks like a new arms race. And I think, well, we discussed this earlier before the show, but you said that it looks like the United States has been caught on their back heel in terms of advanced weaponry. And now they're realizing this and wanting, the first thing they're going to have to do is to exit the INF Treaty in order to start that process of a new arms race. And at the end of the day, Mike, this is all about money.
Well, look, you're saying the United States, and so something I want to get your thoughts on, Patrick, are what that actually means. Because if we look at the difference between the statement that was made by the White House and the statement that was made by Donald Trump, it's quite stark. So the White House's attitude was, enough is enough. The United States has complied with the INF Treaty for more than 30 years, but we will not be held back while Russia cheats. The United States will move forward with developing its own intermediate range conventionally armed ground-launched missile system. In addition, China and Iran, which are not parties to the treaty, each possess more than 1,000 INF treaty range missiles. So they're trying to bring China and Iran into this as well. So that was the White House statement. But then Donald Trump's own statement was quite a bit more conciliatory. So although he did also say that the US would move ahead with developing its own intermediate range missiles, this is what he had to say. At the end of in the last paragraph of his statement, we stand ready to engage with Russia on arms control negotiations. And importantly, once that is done, develop, and perhaps for the first time ever, develop an outstanding relationship on economy, trade, political and military levels. And so, Pat, the thing is, this comes back to Trump's original position, which was that he wanted a rapprochement with Russia. And around him, he seems to have, with these neocons that he has around him in the Pentagon and so on, again, we've got two narratives going on here, and I was just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
I think you pointed out something important, Mike, is that there are rival factions with regards to foreign policy in the United States, but not just that. What's behind foreign policy, the multi-trillion-dollar defense industry is a major force in the United States politically and also globally. So you're talking about some of these major defense contractors, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed Martin. The share prices and the dividends of the shareholders of those companies are very important. And the only way that those share prices are going to continue to be stable and rise is that there's new weapon systems coming online. The United States government is backing the research and development and the implementation of a whole new class and range of weapons. So, that's the arms race, effectively. What you're talking about is Trump's foreign policy objectives, what he campaigned on, and what he would like to see maybe follow through. What will be his legacy as a president? And so those are two distinctively different things. And there are people that would support that Donald Trump foreign policy, Mike. Quite a few people in America, right across a very broad range, actually, through politics, academics, people in civil servants, pundits, commentators, authors, and then there's influencers, basically. And then there's a whole other lobby there to contend with. And these have always been rival factions in the United States, but I think it's more pronounced now. Donald Trump he's one of the first U.S. presidents in recent years to advocate for something like this in terms of, withdrawing U.S. forces from the Middle East. And I talked about this a number of times. I've written about this as part of a re-engineering of the U.S. grand strategy. And it is happening, or it is some people are attempting to make it happen. There are other people who don't want that to happen. They want to sort of hold on to the post-World War II U.S. dominated order, whereby the United States provides for the collective defense of Europe and for the Pacific region. And in exchange gives free access to U.S. markets. And of course, Trump has come in to interrupt this, wants now to rewrite the trade deals, basically, and rewrite the post-World War II world order, in however that was structured, and wants to reform it. Is this because Donald Trump sees a multipolar future that U.S. will have to contend with and be a part of? Or is this Donald Trump representing the interests of reconfiguring the U.S. stances so that the U.S. dominates as it did during the post-World War II order going forward, but under a new Aegis? So that's the question. And we'll talk about that more in terms of the IMF defense strategy on the extra time segment after the show. Yeah. We'll be able to delve a little bit deeper into that, Mike.
Okay, well, let's look at the Russian perspective on this. So Sergei Lavrov met Putin over the weekend. I think Sergei Shoigu was there as well. So Lavrov's saying, all in all, the situation is quite alarming. Let me reiterate that the decision taken by the United States on the INF Treaty is, of course, a matter of serious concern for the entire world, especially for Europe. Nevertheless, the Europeans followed in the footsteps of the United States, with all NATO members speaking out in explicit support of the position adopted by the United States to refrain from any discussions on mutual concerns. All we hear are groundless ultimatums requiring us to take unilateral measures without any evidence to support unfounded accusations. That is a fair comment.
That is the main point.
Yes.
That right there, that is the most important point of this, Mike, is that it's the threats, it's the ultimatums, it's the difference in style of how Russia would like to conduct international relations and how the U.S. is conducting international relations with various different people in the world, which is threats, ultimatums, no coming to the table, no negotiations. In other words, it's our way or the highway. This is our deal. You have to accept it or not. And if you don't, there'll be repercussions, basically. And that's not sitting well with Russia, nor would it sit well with China and other major powers.
Now, the Russians' other main point is this, that the Aegis Ashore missile defense system is an outright violation of the treaty. This is the US system. Launchers of this kind have already been deployed in Romania, and preparations are underway to deploy them in Poland as well as Japan. There is no doubt that these developments make things worse overall in the sphere of nuclear disarmament and strategic stability. It all started with the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, when the US decided to withdraw from it in 2002, as you know all too well. So he's saying that they've seen it before, but the key point here is that they're clearly, and Russia has been saying this for many years, they are upset about the Aegis missile defense system being so close to their borders and the plans to put it in other places close to their borders. Again, it's not an unfair position for them to take, is it?
It's not. It's not. But and if you look at the mainstream goldfish media, I'll end up with this point, with a few laps around the fishbowl, and they forget what was said and done 10 or 15 years ago. When the United States withdrew from the ABM Treaty in 2002, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, it was as I said previously, under the guise of the war on terror. Okay, so the talking point, you go back and look at the media coverage at the time, you look at the statements, they're very specific. Errant missile from Iran hitting Europe. This was one of the, because Russia wasn't public enemy number one during that time. The U.S. had quite good relations with Russia, so Russia wasn't the threat. So Iran was the threat, or the threat of a nuclear Iran. Firing an errant missile that went off course and suddenly hit Europe or whatever, or Saddam Hussein's 45 minutes or less missile, a Scud missile, which is a adapted V2 rocket, right? So that is, so they'll just change the narrative to justify the policy depending on what age we're in. So now Russia is public enemy number one, so that's the convenient excuse, the window dressing, as it were, for the withdrawal from the INF Treaty, Mike. But the truth is, Mike, that if the U.S. has decided to withdraw from this treaty, it doesn't matter if Russia's public enemy number one, or if China's public enemy number one, or if it's some other rogue state that had come on the horizon. This was absolutely. I believe this is forces within the United States driving this agenda more than international stability or threats.
Right. Okay, well, we'll just finish this off with this article from Politico magazine. The headline is, "The US and Russia are sleepwalking towards nuclear disaster." This is former Senator Sam Nunn and former Energy Secretary Ernest J. Moniz. Is that how you pronounce it? Moniz? Right.
Yep.
They're the co-chairman of the Nuclear Threat Initiative. So they say that re-engagement with Russia is too important to wait for the Mueller probe to end. That means it is time for Congress to take the lead. They're saying Friday morning's announcement from Secretary of State Mike Pompeo that America will withdraw from the INF Treaty because of Russia's violations is the latest wake-up call that relations between the world's nuclear superpowers are dangerously off the rails. The fear of nuclear confrontation was once omnipresent in Washington and Moscow. National leaders have recognized the real risk that a military conflict could quickly emerge and escalate, and that they would be forced to calculate in minutes whether survival required going nuclear first with catastrophic consequences. So they're painting a pretty dark picture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, we'll talk about the game theory behind that during the UKC Extra Time segment after the show for members and subscribers. But yeah, well.
Okay, let's move on to Venezuela then. And as expected and as warned, the United Kingdom has now recognized Juan Guaido as the constitutional interim president of Venezuela until credible presidential elections can be held. That's the statement that Jeremy Hunt made this morning. And of course, they had said, I think about a week ago, that unless elections were called, that this is what would happen. Hunt went on to say the oppression of the legitimate kleptocratic Maduro regime must end. Those who continue to violate human rights of ordinary Venezuelans under an illegitimate regime will be called to account. We've heard this type of rhetoric so many times before, Patrick. It was followed up with Macron, who tweeted this out earlier, basically saying more or less the same thing. The Netherlands, Germany, Denmark, Spain, and Sweden have also joined the UK and France, and also the United States as well, obviously. What are your thoughts of Hunt's comments accusing the Maduro regime, in inverted commas, being a kleptocracy?
Well, I think Jeremy Hunt, Alan Duncan, these are two faces in British politics that seem to be the vanguard of this call for regime change in Venezuela. So it sets a dangerous precedent. Of course, you can't appoint an interim president. Presidents are elected through elections. So it's antithetical to the whole concept of democracy that these Western European countries are purporting to be espousing the great and wonderful values of. So it.
But we've got precedent there because in Yemen, for example, Hadi, they are keeping him high and dry as a president of that country when in fact he had resigned as president
Twice.
Twice.
Yeah.
So there are elections required there as well. So this seems to be a precedent from the Western nations who claim to be there to uphold the rule of law and maintain democracy worldwide, but their version of democracy seems to include making presidential appointments.
Yeah, because the military intervention option, Mike, is less and less popular and also less and less feasible now. This is the new sort of process regime change that the West is involved in. Administrative regime change, where there's a level of postmodernist projection involved, where we're projecting this is the legitimate leader. They come up with a candidate, a face. In the case of Juan Guaido, he's actually been groomed for this position for years by the United States government. And just a little bit of cursory research, you can find this out. Of course, this is completely lost on the great and the good in Europe. Well, they probably, to be fair, Mike, they probably don't even know that, judging by some of the rhetoric and discourse by some European politicians. They're totally out to lunch, especially on affairs that are in another hemisphere, okay? They're bad enough on the Middle East. On South America, I would say they're probably equally as clueless. But what Britain's concerned, Mike, is Britain is the soft power experts. So their job is soft power. It's softening up Venezuelan society through a myriad of NGOs working on the ground to reframe communities, to reframe values through the UN, through different NGOs and programs, and to provide the media support for that through the BBC, through the mainstream media outlets in order to sort of frame the Venezuelan situation a certain way. This is where Britain excels at. The United States excels, has other skill sets, more hard power, more force and brutal diplomacy. So the US and Britain work hand in hand all over the world for the same objectives.
Well, if all these countries have come out in support of Juan Guaido, the EU, of course, came out as well and said the same thing. But Italy seems to have gone off script here, Patrick.
Well, they have, and this group in Italy is becoming more and more interesting by the day. So Italy's announced a veto at an informal meeting of an EU foreign ministers meeting that took place in Romania. And basically, this will be an affront to Federica Mogherini, who recognized the U.S. appointed president of Venezuela as the interim president. So this is becoming more and more interesting. So Mario and Salvini, the dynamic duo in Italy, chastised Emmanuel Macron for holding on to still basically doing colonialism in Africa and calling out the CS franc. Here they are again. So this is an interesting opposition that's shaped up here in Southern Europe against Brussels.
Yes.
I think this is great. Politically, Mike, I think this is very healthy. I don't think the people in Brussels would probably agree with that.
No, I don't think they
particular view, but I think this is very healthy. To have this kind of balance in terms of foreign policy dialogue in Europe is fantastic. And there's a lot to be said for a lot of the positions Italy's taking, also being on the front line of the migrant crisis.
So what's Marco Rubio been up to?
Well, little Marco has been busy. He's been busy with Venezuela. He is in contact, according to his own boastings here on Twitter, to military officials that he's been in contact with. So he's on the phone. Basically, Marco Rubio is the heir apparent. More and more, he's looking like the heir apparent to John McCain.
Right.
So if there's anything dirty or anything criminal going on in the world, if there's any weapons that need to be trafficked, any rebels or moderate rebels that need to be armed and backed, any civil wars that need to be stoked, John McCain, that was his job for so many years. And now it looks like Marco Rubio has slipped right in behind John McCain, and he's attempting to show his chops, his regime change chops in the Western Hemisphere right here. And History will remember as heroes those who step forward at this moment. Unbelievable.
This is the same type of rhetoric as George W. Bush and Tony Blair. History will remember that, will judge our decisions. Will, you know, they were clearly implying that history would see them in a positive light.
Yeah.
He seems to be echoing this attitude.
It's the same delusional mindset. Definitely, it's a neoconservative mindset, basically, and it is very much. It's as much projectionism as the left-wing version of postmodern projectionism. Neoconservatism and responsibility protect progressivism is the same thing. You could put a razor blade between it. The only difference is in the style, in the rhetoric. So with Marco Rubio, you're seeing definitely is a neoconservative version here, and he's been rebuked by a number of commentators. Here's George Samuelsy. He's saying, watch for the rooftop snipers a la Maidan 2014. Watch for little Marco, and the rest immediately accuse Maduro of ordering the massacre of civilians and demand the military to step in and stop the madman Maduro. We've heard that before. CIA doesn't vary this script too much.
Except when France is concerned.
Well, yes, that's something to be said.
Yeah.
What's been going on in France in the targeting of protesters, but yeah. So Marco is not done, and this is where it gets interesting for everybody out there who uses social media. This is an issue that's not confined to the Venezuela or the Pentagon. Marco Rubio is boasting this week. This is pretty shocking, Mike. Twitter took down, he says, 2,000 accounts located in Venezuela, in Caracas, I believe, engaged in state-backed disinformation and influence campaign. What is an influence campaign? Via Politico, and so he's Apple operating system here. So basically, is Twitter working with the CIA? Is Twitter working with the U.S. government? Is Twitter working with the office of Marco Rubio to target pro-government user accounts in Venezuela in order to shut them down, to censor them from San Francisco?
Well, who made the decision about which accounts were to be targeted? That's the question.
Well, that's a question. Well, who's advising Twitter and Facebook on these sort of matters? We have the Atlantic Council, we have the DFR labs, we have people like this. So the censorship of Silicon Valley, of the Jack Dorseys of the world in San Francisco, their hand of censorship extends into all countries around the world. So if there's an upheaval going on, an Arab Spring type event, a political campaign, a presidential election, anywhere in the world, Twitter now has set the precedent, as Facebook has, that they will step in and delete accounts that the U.S. government has told them they don't like. And make no mistake, that's exactly what happened in this situation. To think that Twitter did this on its own volition, they have their own Venezuela analysis department in San Francisco, I don't think so. I don't think so. They're being advised, Mike, and they're being advised by quasi-military organizations or military intelligence organizations, integrity initiative type advice, or from groups like the Atlantic Council, a NATO-backed think tank. These are giving the orders to social media companies how to sort of moderate and censor the global conversation as hotspots pop up. It's very dangerous. And to see Marco Rubio boasting about this publicly shows you that the problem is really deep.
Well, it is really deep, and I want to highlight this as something which is really dangerous as well. This is the most disgusting piece of propaganda from the Daily Mail. The headline is "Starving, Sold to Pedophiles, or Simply Abandoned, How Venezuela's Children Are Paying the Terrible Price for the Country's Failed Socialist Experiment." And they're saying that that hospitals are taking in children abandoned, sick and starving. Children are being sold to pedophiles for sex so their families can eat. Some hospitals have been abandoned by President Maduro's government. So it begins, pity the children starving to death, dying of curable diseases, sold to sexual predators, or simply abandoned. Youngsters are paying a terrible price for Venezuela's failed socialist experiment. Really, this, I'm quite sure, is going on, Patrick, and it is tragic. But the way that this article is presented is purely as a propaganda piece to drive for some kind of military intervention in this country. The Daily Mail, this type of...
But is it going on? This is the question. Is it really going on? Because if we looked at some of the stories out of Syria, very similar stories they were running in order to demonize the Assad government in 2011, 2012, and onwards, there's a potential for major embellishment here. There are not people starving, emaciated in the streets of Venezuela. It's not happening, okay? Despite how some of the reports are trying to portray this. Yes, there are food shortages, there are supply shortages, there's hyperinflation, but it's not famine right now.
Okay.
So I could see a drug addict, a parent who's a heroin addict or a crack addict selling their child for sex. That's a common problem in many places in the world, right? But strictly on a lack of food, that story I would say deserves to be looked at a little closer to see exactly what the context is, where this claim comes from, where's the cases exactly.
Okay, but
it's debatable.
Let's talk about context just a little bit. Let's assume some people are starving and there's some pretty tragic stuff going on over there. Why are people starving? Are people starving because of the failed socialist experiment, or are people starving because of sanctions that are being placed on Venezuela by the US government, for example?
Well, the answer to that question is probably all of the above, Mike.
So
everything's contributing to that,
sure.
To that situation.
So would the Daily Mail driving for intervention in this way, is that going to help people in Venezuela in the short or even the medium term? Does Syria suggest that would be the case? This seems to be a likely outcome of this type of rhetoric from the likes of the Daily Mail would be at the very least intervention from the West, or perhaps a civil war, Syrian-style civil war in inverted commas, because of course we know that wasn't a Syrian civil war. And look, I'm just gonna highlight this as well. This is from the Foreign Office this morning, being pushed out on their Twitter feed once again. Sexual violence being used as a weapon of war. But we're promoting these wars around the world. We are promoting these wars, Patrick.
And instability, destabilization campaigns.
And absolutely, and therefore it is utterly hypocritical of us to suggest that we've got to stop the use of sexual violence as a weapon of war. Stop the war in the first place, and then the sexual violence can't be used as a weapon of war.
Well, if you look at the news reports, Mike, in the preceding the Libyan war, okay, one of the big media stories, and this was amplified by Susan Rice from the Obama administration. Many other people repeated that Gaddafi was issuing Viagra to his evil mercenary soldiers to go and rape Libyan women, basically. And that got huge traction, cascaded across the media. People were outraged. Oh my God, even Al Jazeera made a meal out of this. Specifically, that network as well made a meal out of it. And it was a fake news story. It was completely fake, but was parroted by top Obama administration officials and was used in the media terms anyway as a justification for the UN resolution, the no-fly zone, and then the bombing raids after that. So again, that's a familiar, a hot button, a motive story. Rape is a weapon of war. The Daily Beast ran a fake news story that Assad had his gangs going through Aleppo as they liberated Aleppo, East Aleppo, and they were raping. And women were committing mass suicide to avoid being raped by the evil Assad regime. That was a fake story. That was actually put out by Michael Wise, CNN correspondent and writer for the Daily Beast, former communications director of the Henry Jackson Society, put out that fake news story. And they quoted a source from inside Syria. Again, rape as a weapon of war. So we see it's just used repeatedly. When is this going to surface in Venezuela, Mike? Next week? We're going to start seeing stories about mass rape by Maduro's
Well, if that Daily Mail article is anything to go by, that's very likely.
I expect that we're going to see that pretty soon, yeah.
Yes, okay. Well, let's head over to the United States then. And our favorite presidential candidate, Tulsi Gabbard.
Well, here she is. She's saying a lot of great things, Mike. She's probably the most exciting candidate right now in terms of a transformational candidate. This is an important word in U.S. politics, a transformational candidate. And she said a number of things, including this just yesterday, I believe. As Commander-in-Chief, I will work to end the new Cold War, the nuclear arms race, and the slide into nuclear war. That is why the neocon, neolib warmongers will do anything to stop me.
Now, just a bit of background. Tulsi Gabbard is Congresswoman for Hawaii.
From Hawaii.
And she's ex-military.
She is. She's an Iraq War veteran. I believe she was an EMT in the U.S. Army. So she has real war experience in Iraq, and she's a senior Congresswoman from Hawaii. So yeah, she does have tremendous qualifications, and she has been to Syria, Mike. She's one of the only U.S. politicians that entered legally into Syria. So this is the treatment she's getting. Look at this. Okay, this is from NBC. This is one of the major networks in the United States. This is deemed as the gold standard by NewsGuard and all these fact-checking organizations. Russia's propaganda machine discovers 2020 Democratic candidate Tulsi Gabbard. So they're basically saying that her campaign is being driven by the Russians, basically. So experts who track website and social media links to Russia, here we go again, have seen some
stirrings
of a possible campaign of support for the Hawaii Democrat. Mind you, she's running as a Democrat. So let's look at what this says. So incredibly, within a few days of Gabbard announcing a presidential bid, Disinfo 2018, part of the cybersecurity firm New Knowledge, found that the top 15 URLs, shared URLs, 800 social media accounts, affiliated, this is the key, Mike, with known and suspected Russian propaganda operations. That could be anybody or anything that holds a view outside of the US-UK foreign policy or orthodoxy. And so they're basically directing information around at U.S. citizens about Tulsi Gabbard. So basically, they're claiming that she doesn't have her own support base. This is all Russian-driven stuff. And so who's behind this claim? This is the thing, the New Knowledge. That's an interesting firm. Where did we hear about them recently? Well, let's take a look. The New Knowledge, this is what they do. We detect, monitor, and mitigate social media manipulation. Containing an attack is safer and less costly than recovering from one. They're talking about the 2016 elections.
Yes.
That was supposedly an attack by Russia, right? So we protect companies from the negative impact of false fake news, etc. So here they are, Mike, the New Knowledge. We're involved in election fraud. These were Democratic Party operatives. This is a firm that spawned out of a project funded by the LinkedIn founder. His name's Reid Hoffman. He's a billionaire, a Democratic Party donor. And they created Russian bot farms. And they planted fake news stories in order to discredit the Republican candidate in the Alabama Senate race. So Roy Moore, I believe his name was. That's the New Knowledge. Here they are. They were caught red-handed. And not only that, just a couple weeks later, Mike, as you can see, NBC is quoting them to take down Tulsi Gabbard. Isn't this incredible? How corrupt is the U.S. electoral scene right now? And they're supposed to be policing. These are the firms tasked with policing Russian influence and fake news. They were caught involved in election fraud. So amazing. Like, there's nothing you can do to get discredited if you're on the right side of a certain side of the political aisle.
Yeah.
So it doesn't end there, Mike. So let's look at this story. So Twitter is now taking sides of candidates. In this case, it's the Democratic anointed candidate, for the moment anyway, is Kamala Harris, the freshman senator from California. And so they've deleted accounts that were supposedly trolling Kamala Harris. But were they really trolling her? If you look at this, these accounts apparently were created recently, had few followers, but they posted easily shareable content about the senator's actual record as a prosecutor that earned what they call an outsized audience on the platform. So the content was accurate. It was the record of Kamala Harris, But according to Twitter, it earned an outsized audience. In other words, it attracted too much attention. The information was too good. It went too viral. And what was the response of Twitter? To go and delete the account.
Yes.
So
who's influencing elections then?
Well, Twitter is basically managing and shooting down any opposition to Kamala Harris on their platform. At the same time, this is the same Twitter, Mike, that's deleting pro-government accounts in Caracas, Venezuela.
Yeah.
So on one hand, they're working for the Democratic Party, which is supposedly the political left, and on the other hand, they're working for the neoconservatives and Marco Rubio. Twitter, I mean, they will prostitute themselves to anybody that basically tells them what they need to do. I mean, this is just unbelievable. This is a really nefarious organization, I think.
So this is her, is it?
This is Kamala Harris, so she is the anointed Democratic candidate for the moment, Mike, but words on the street that the real stars have not graced the stage yet, and they will do in the spring.
So what chance does Tulsi Gabbard have against Kamala and her colleagues?
Well, this is a good question, Mike, and we can game this out in maybe more detail during the extra session after the show, but look, judging by the media's treatment of Tulsi Gabbard, and right now they can attack Tulsi Gabbard. I don't think she stands a very good chance. Even with a great popular upswell of support, it might not be enough because right now they're attacking Mike, but as soon as the debates start next year, they will then mute any candidates that they don't like. So they will not give them time on the networks. They won't give them any column inches in any of the papers. They won't give them any time. They might not even let them on the debate stage. They'll come up, they're notorious for coming up with rules that qualify you to be in a national debate. During the Republican campaign in the 2016 campaign, we saw a lot of chicanery going on as to who was going to be allowed on. So they restricted it to poll numbers, like which polls they chose. If you received less than 20%, you did not have a seat at the table, as it were. So I think they'll probably do this to Tulsi Gabbard. They'll airbrush her right out during the primary period. And if there's anything exciting going on, they won't cover it. Because what they don't want to do is allow her to gain any momentum. And the media absolutely has the potential to control that process in terms of momentum and candidates going viral. And with Jack Dorsey and Twitter on the DNC's team, they'll have no problem shutting her out on Twitter as well. And if Zuckerberg does his job at Facebook, then they can completely make Tulsi Gabbard disappear between the mainstream media and Silicon Valley. So that's what Team Blue looks to have in store.
Okay. Okay. Quick reminder that if you like what we're doing here at the UK Column, we would appreciate your support. You can join us by going to ukcolumn.org/community and taking out a membership if you'd like to do that. That would be much appreciated. And a quick reminder that AV 9.1 DVDs sets are available on the UK Column website now. Brian Garish speaking on that, Alex Thompson, yourself, Patrick, Dr. Graham Downing, and Ian R. Crane do get your DVDs if you would like to. Now let's come back to the UK and to Tony Gosling. Now Tony Gosling, well known to many people that would watch this program, but if you don't know him, he's was formerly a BBC presenter, and he's got his own radio program on Bristol. BCfm in Bristol.
Community radio in Bristol.
Absolutely. Now Ofcom has now launched an investigation into the politics program which he hosts. It's a weekly program, and this follows a submission by this is the UK Lawyers for Israel group, and particularly their director Sam Green. And he's complained that the politics show is being used for the propagation of conspiracy theorists and theories and extremist views. So in his report to Ofcom, he highlighted a number of issues that he was unhappy with, involving Israel being the most dangerous country in the Middle East is one of the allegations that is claimed to have been made on this program, that the CIA had tried to assassinate Vladimir Putin, by hacking his car. I think basically they were covering stuff that was in the mainstream media at the time,
As well.
if I remember rightly, because
yeah.
that CIA tried to assassinate Vladimir Putin by hacking his car was a mainstream media story.
Yeah.
So so anyway, he has taken this to Ofcom, and Ofcom has decided to investigate. They've just put this in their latest bulletin, and as you can see, Politics show from BCfm, particularly the one from the 23rd of November last year, is being investigated. Well, we wait to see what happens there, but I find it interesting that it was somebody who's representing an Israeli lobby that seems to have brought this complaint in the first place.
So he objects to the idea that someone said that Israel is the most dangerous country in the Middle East.
Yes.
I think there's quite a few million people, especially those living in the Middle East, that probably agree with that statement, because after all, isn't Israel the only country that has attacked all of its neighbors practically unprovoked in almost every case? That's Israel. So yes, they are a scourge on the region, Mike. But according to this complaint, and likely to be enforced by the official state censors at Ofcom, that's just not allowed. That's wrongthink.
Well, yes, and indeed, if there's to be a restriction of free speech on broadcast radio, there's also been discussion of free speech with respect to universities going on, and this report released by the Equality and Human Rights Commission, entitled Freedom of Expression, a Guide for Higher Education Providers and Students' Unions in England and Wales. This is saying that in order to protect legal expression, or at least there was a requirement to protect legal expression. This is a legal requirement for most higher education providers. Holding open, challenging debates rather than silencing the views of those we don't agree with helps to build tolerance and address prejudice and discrimination, said their chairman, David Isaac. Our guidance makes clear that freedom of speech in higher education should be upheld at every opportunity and should only be limited where there are genuine safety concerns or constitutes unlawful behaviour. And of course, this has come out of criticism of universities for either not holding presentations by certain people, or perhaps certain people have been invited to speak and other people decided that that wasn't necessarily appropriate, that those certain people should speak. So this is a 53-page document, and reading through it this morning, Patrick, what's clear is that it becomes a pretty onerous job to actually hold one of these events, because decisions have to be made about whether it's appropriate to hold the event, to make sure that you're crossing all the T's and dotting all the I's with respect to the legislation, making sure that you're recording every decision that you make for either deciding for or against a particular speaker. And so, frankly, it gets to the point where it's practically impossible for you to hold an event without doing about a year's work ahead of time, just to make sure that you've covered yourself and covered your back. Where does this end up? One of the things that this thing is saying is that you've got to make sure that you've checked against the prevent strategy and make sure that whoever's speaking isn't going to be in breach of the prevent strategy and in breach of various anti-terrorist laws, and so on. At what point does somebody who's actually simply critical of the system become too extreme to speak? This document doesn't seem to be really about highlighting how you enable these types of, or enable free speech in this way. It's more about how you put so much bureaucracy in place that you discourage people from holding any way controversial talks.
That's the general idea, Mike. You're catching on very quick.
Yes.
Yeah, you're catching on really quick. What you just described is a shadow state, the prevent strategy, various anti-terror laws, written and unwritten, and that you have to comply with a whole raft of shadow regulations on top of what you had thought were perceived to be your rights.
Right.
So yeah, it's pretty amazing. There's a Kafkaesque irony there.
Absolutely. Okay, well look, let's just end on this one. Patrick, Home Office spying on asylum seekers by tracking debit card use.
Well, this is quite extraordinary, Mike. Now, this might be counterintuitive to some people out there, but you might say, well, those asylum seekers, they need to be tracked. They want to make asylum applications, stay in Britain, have benefits, and so forth. But let's think about this for a minute. So this is according to the report. Individuals have had their asylum support withdrawn from making trips to see relatives or attending court hearings because officials accuse them of venturing out of their authorized cities, according to a report by the Sunday Times. How are they tracking them? Well, this is also interesting here. The surveillance is said to be carried out through Aspen cards. So this is a form of a debit card which is used by asylum seekers to enable them to buy food, basic supplies, and get their weekly stipend of £37.75. So so you're probably thinking, well, what's wrong with that? Well, the point is, Mike, and I know this might, again, be counterintuitive to certain people out there, but if they're tracking these people in this way, with this technology, you better believe that you are being tracked in exactly the same way. So expect that that is the case. Are you okay with that? Are you okay with all of your movements and purchases being tracked and logged, and then yourself being profiled based on that data? Are you okay with that? This is the question.
It's a very good question.
You might be okay with that asylum seeker, that happening then, but what about yourself? Because you better believe this is happening right now, Mike.
Absolutely. Okay, we will leave it there for today, and thank you very much for joining us, Patrick. Thank you for joining us. We'll be back at the same time on Wednesday, 1 p.m. as usual. We will see you then.
And join us later on for UKC Extra Time, when we're going to break down the game theory behind the INF missile defense, war gaming, and also we'll talk about the Tulsi Gabbard 2020 campaign. What are her chances in 2020?
Okay, thank you. See you Wednesday. Bye-bye.